Hello everyone, and welcome. This event is brought to you by the Women's Climate Congress, and we're very excited to be here for our July 1st, the Tuesday conversation. The topic today is women's voices changing the public conversation on climate change. And we're featuring Dr Rebecca Huntley, author of How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, and Dr Jonica Newby, author of Beyond Climate Grief, a journey of love, snow, fire, and an enchanted beer can, in conversation with Congress founder, Dr. Janet Salisbury. I'm Lynn Stevens, and I'm a founding member of the Congress, which was established just 18 months ago. It's an Australia-wide network of women of all political persuasions and from all walks of life. We're committed to collaborative, non-partisan action on climate change, the importance of bringing women's voices to the foreground on this most critical issue. And our topic today is very close to our hearts at the Congress, and it sits well with some of our core values relating to no blame and the power of collaboration, acknowledgement that we have all benefited from the industrial age, and belief in the power of women's voices when they speak from the universal desire to look after the young and to focus on the common good. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge country on behalf of all of us. We acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands where we meet today, noting that sovereignty has never been ceded. We pay our respects to First Peoples elders, past, present, and emerging. And in this NAIDOC week, I would like to add this poem, Acknowledgement of Country by Hazel Hall. This land is the song of Indigenous peoples, all those who walked here and all their descendants. Song of the creatures and spirits of dreaming, song of the children and culture they lost. This land holds the lines of its earliest owners, custodians who respected the earth, lines of their knowledge and wisdom of elders. We ask to walk with you in concord and peace. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping now before I hand over to Janet to introduce our guests. We have allowed an hour 15 for this conversation to give us time to explore it in some depth. And this will include 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions from you, which we'll invite via the chat. So we encourage you to use the chat as we go through to introduce yourself and where you're from, and to comment on any aspect of the conversation and to raise any questions you'd like the speakers to consider. Part of my role today is to monitor the chat and to select some comments or questions at the end, which may help us all to expand our understanding of this topic. We may not get to all of the questions, but we will record them and keep them as part of this conversation. We have quite a lot of people joining us today, and that's great. And to ensure the best possible experience for everyone, please mute yourself. And finally, this event is being recorded in Speaker View and will be placed on our website and shared on social media. It's possible gallery view may creep in, and so if you prefer not to appear, please turn off your video now. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Janet so she can get the main game started. And I'm going to do it in a little more detail today than we usually do, because I know that we have a number of people joining us who may know very little about the Congress and about Janet's story. So this is about Janet. After a number of postdoctoral years working in cancer research, Janet moved to science communications. And in 1999, she founded the company Biotext, which has grown to be an Australian leader in science content development and publishing. She has retired now, but remains on the board and retains an interest in this area. Through her work in science communication,
yes, I'm putting this on.
She became interested in dialogue, initially in relation to public discourse around new biotechnologies, and later around public policy more generally. In 2006, she joined the Canberra group A Chorus of Women and became attracted to exploring the significant role that the arts can play in connecting us to our common humanity. And this thread is also reflected in the Congress. With A Chorus of Women, she initiated a series of public conversations in the ACT over several years called Canberra Conversations, which aimed to create a safe space for community conversations around issues of citizen concern. More recently, dismayed by the political roadblocks to effective action on climate change, even in the face of the disastrous Black Summer bushfires, she founded the Women's Climate Congress in January 2020 to work for united, non-partisan action on climate change. And this year, we were delighted when she was named as a finalist in the environment sector of the Women's Agenda Leadership Awards. It's my pleasure now to hand over to you, Janet, to take us forward.
Oh, thank you very much, Lynn, and for that introduction. I thought I was going to start with just a little bit about our well-known Australian poet, Judith Wright. I first really got to know Judith Wright through my association with A Chorus of Women in Canberra that Lynn just mentioned, because in 2007, 2008 and 2009, each of those 3 years, we actually made presentations in Science Week in Canberra about climate change. And in 2007, our presentation, which was called On the Edge of Silence, was based around the poetry and also the essays that Judith Wright has written. So Judith Wright was one of the first Australian poets who really opened Australian eyes to the engagement that poetry can have with philosophical ideas, history, racism, and also our relationship with the environment. But when she was 70, she became very sort of frustrated with some of these issues in our public discourse, and she gave up writing poetry in order to work more directly for change in our treatment of the Australian environment and also for rights of First Nations people. And in one of her several essays, really interesting essays that she wrote on science and the arts, she wrote, "How are we to convince the largely urban populations of today that their continuing well-being will depend on the well-being of the biosphere, the country and marine environments they so seldom see and know so little about?" And she went on, "Conservationists with the world's most urgent battle on their hands must begin to enlist not only rational recognition of the problem, but human concern, distress and love." This seems to me the great chance for poetry and for the reversal of the otherwise relentless process of destruction which threatens us and the world around us. The risk is that time is so short and the opposing forces are so strong. The abyss is terribly near and terribly tempting, and the choice of real responsibility and real understanding is a fearsome prospect. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our two guests for today, Jonica and Rebecca. And I should just mention this because some of you maybe saw our earlier advertising that we're sorry that Angela Maharaj, who is the president of the Australian Oceanographic and Meteorological Society and a climate scientist, was not able to join us. But we know that we're going to have a very lively conversation with Rebecca and Jonica that will fill up the time very well. In fact, we have allowed an extra 15 minutes today compared to our usual conversations, just so that we can fully explore ideas that might be coming up. And so do feel free to put things in the chat. So Rebecca Huntley is one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends. She is an author and researcher and holds degrees in law, film studies, and a PhD in gender studies. Her recent publication, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, uses insights from psychology, neuroscience, and sociology to show why the commonly used information deficit model of communication is deeply flawed. Rebecca's central proposition is that communication about climate change must take into account the human characteristics of emotion, imagination, and loyalty to tribe. To make a difference, we need to understand the range of emotions people react with when presented with the science of climate change. Jonica is a science reporter, author, TV presenter, and director, best known for her 2 decades on ABC TV's popular weekly show, Catalyst. She's twice won the Eureka Award, Australia's most prestigious science journalism prize, and is a recipient of a World TV Award. Her book, Beyond Climate Grief, A Journey of Love, Fire, Snow, and Enchanted Beer Can, is her first book, and it features conversations with Missy Higgins, comedian Charlie Pickering, business leader Mike Cannon-Brookes, practical advice from psychological and scientific experts, incredible accounts from everyday heroes, plus inspiring stories from the climate strike kids. Beyond Climate Grief provides guidance and emotional sustenance to help shore up courage for the uncertainties ahead. It reminds us of the love, beauty, and wonder in the world, and even amidst disaster, how we all have a touch of epic hero in us. So Rebecca and Jonica's books approach talking about climate change from 2 different directions. Rebecca's focus is more on connecting emotionally to communicate with others, and Jonica's on managing her own emotional load. But I think they probably both relate well to those words from Judith Wright that I read out earlier. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Rebecca. You structured your book on how to talk about climate change around emotions, human concern, distress, and love, as Judith Wright suggested, and a range of other emotions. Can you start by telling us a little about why this emotional lens spoke to you as a way to communicate your research on how to talk to people about this big issue?
Yes, you're right. I mean, I did go through it that way. I suppose I do have 2 chapters that are kind of more foundational before I go through those emotions, which is to understand the extent to which fact can help us. So an appeal to scientific fact and reason, which is not irrelevant, but it can't get us all the way there. So a little bit of work around that, like the limitations and the capacity for fact to persuade. And then the critical, important role of emotion in persuasion. So, I mean, for anybody who's a professional science communicator like yourself, it's a little bit like science communication 101, I suppose. But it was, as somebody who is a social scientist rather than a natural scientist communicating, it was a little bit about me trying to educate myself around that as well. And then I didn't do psychology at university. I did other kinds of degrees, and I've learned about psychology and, you know, the science around human emotion kind of almost indirectly in the work I do as a social researcher rather than academically. And so I felt that I almost needed to break it down quite fundamentally, first for myself, but also for a engaged but not expert reader. So one of the a kind of mentor and friend and colleague of many years, Carmen Lawrence, who is at University of Western Australia now and an emeritus professor there, and does a lot of work in this area. So yeah, it reads very much like Climate Change Communication 101, but for people who don't really even know that that's a thing. Yes. So it helped for me to do that. It also, in a sense, mirrored the kind of the trajectory of my own emotional response as I wrote the book during the Black Summer fires. But it revealed to me too, as well, so it's less, you know, I started thinking that it was a progression from unconstructive negative emotions like, you know, fear and anger and all the rest of it to positive constructive emotions like love and hope. But that's a furphy as well. They're all there. They exist not so much as a progression, but as a much more on a flatter plane in that they can all be helpful, they can all be constructive, they can all be rational responses to engagement with climate science. You know, it's a completely rational response to be, when you really engage with it, to be angry, to be fearful, to be blamey, perhaps to feel guilt, perhaps to feel shame, a whole range of things. And so while it started out almost in my mind as a progression, it wasn't so much of a progression as a kind of an engagement with these emotions to a different point. And even though it ends with love, it's not so much that that's linear, it's also quite cyclical, as we know, you know, the various stages of grief can be as well. So.
And Jonica, you chose to structure your book around emotions as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on for you there?
Yeah, well, I was getting emotional. So I'd had this moment where, having been a science reporter for all those decades, I suddenly realized that something terribly important and personal to me was actually at stake. And so it's the moment when the intellectual of climate change suddenly goes from that abstract over there to gut-wrenching and personal. And for me, it actually plunged me into a profound depression. And to the point where I actually, for the first time in my life, sought antidepressants. And this was an entirely personal experience, and I tried to find my own way through it. I had no intention of writing a book, but then by 2019, I just had a series of conversations with other people totally unrelated, and they started talking about their own experiences. And I suddenly woke up mid-year and just went, oh my goodness, I need to write a book about how to journey through this. I didn't even have a word for it originally, but of course I've settled on the term climate grief, because I think it just encompasses so many things. And the other thing, you know, back to what Rebecca was talking about, these are rational responses. Grief isn't a pathology. It's a rational response to this overwhelming news. And it also, grief encompasses a cyclical range of emotions, if you like. So the specific trigger for me, and I should just mention that the nature of my book, the other thing was that when I did write it, I decided to write it as a story, as a memoir, because I hadn't really seen that done in the climate space. And I personally like stories. I'm a fiction reader. So I wanted to bring a bit of epic journey and Lord of the Rings. And, you know, I've got pretty mountains on the cover and so on. So to give you a hint that it's you do get taken on my quest. So it came about because of my love for snow, and I'm actually sitting in snow country at the moment, because that's been subsequently one of the promises to myself, that I'd spend a bit of time with the snow each year while we've still got it. So in 2017, I was on holidays and I had this encounter with a, sorry, am I still there? Everything's dropped out on my system. Hello? Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, something's just Zoom bombed me.
Yeah, somebody started sharing their screen or something. Yeah, mine's all gone.
Okay, all right. Where was I? So I'm assuming you can see me. So in 2017, yeah, I was skiing in Japan, and I was loving it, and it was the first time I'd been there, and I was skiing with this Swiss ski instructor, and I asked him, you know, what are you doing? Why are you here in January, his busiest time of year? And he said that Switzerland had no snow. That winter, it had been a green Christmas, and then later that week, half the Great Barrier Reef died. And the thing is, I just had this gut-wrenching moment where I looked around at my magical kingdom and thought, oh my God, you know, this could happen to the snow. And I should backtrack and explain that I'd been in love with snow since I was a little kid. Like, I grew up in Perth, and there wasn't a lot of snow there, but snow is full of it's in our fantasies, it's in our stories, it's in Narnia and Lord of the Rings, and imagine Frodo trying to do all his things in the tropics. It just doesn't have the same resonance. So to me, snow didn't just represent an ecosystem, it's also this sense of wonder and enchantment and magic. And it came to be one of those places I call heart places, and we all have them, places that we fall in love with as much as we fall in love with a person. And I'd specifically later in life fallen in love with a real snow place where I am now, Coonaminamagi, which is Australia's snowy mountains. And they are, I promise you, every bit as stunning and beautiful and magical as anything that I read about in stories as a child. I mean, just yesterday I was up looking at the snow gums and they were doing their thing. They were ice rimed and they were glowing like chandeliers against the sun. We don't have that anywhere else in the world. So when I realized that that this could go, I spent a year researching what was going to happen to the snow, and at the end of that I just started crying, and that was when I got to the point of visiting my doctor to seek antidepressants. And ultimately I thought, I can't be the only one asking this question. How do I go forward and live a good and happy life under the weight of this fearsome knowledge? So that was my quest. So it's very much a sort of, you could say, a self-help type of structure, but it's, me trying to find the best advice and strategies, and then the journey takes a whole other turn, because like Rebecca, I was writing it during the fires, and my mum lives in Mallacoota, and disasters and disaster brain, and what happens to our brains during disasters all became part of the mix and the story.
Thanks, Jonica. Jonica talks about snow, which is her central theme in her book and is her heart space. I personally have a heart space, which is the underwater marine world. And particularly I have a love of coral. I can't bear the thought of the Great Barrier Reef dying. Other people might have their own heart spaces. You can pop them in the chat if you want to share with us what it is for you. We probably all have our own really special places that we relate to. And I love the whole idea of the story. You're a great storyteller, Jonica, in your book. It's full of stories, and that is, of course, a wonderful way that we communicate through story. So just following up a little bit, so maybe Rebecca, you could say a little bit more. First of all, I wanted to follow up on a couple more of the different emotions that you both talk about, but you could talk a little bit more about some key ways in the book you talk about how this helps us to communicate.
If you don't mind, I'm interested in reflecting on the heart spaces part of it. One of the challenges around climate, rather than around environment, but particularly around climate change, is that we have to make a way to connect climate change to people who don't have natural heart spaces as part of their life, right? So I started kind of hiking in the Australian bush and I didn't grow up in the Australian bush. I grew up inside, in the piazzas of Italy and the little side streets of Oxford and Cambridge. I'd never seen my parents run. I've never seen them swim. I've never seen them climb a tree. I didn't grow up in a natural environment at all. I kind of learnt to love one. And so in a sense, if we've got people who already have extraordinary value for natural spaces, then they're probably going to really be on our side, be on the side of climate anyway. What we have to do is broaden the climate narrative to connect it to things, to every part of our life, right? Which isn't necessarily around nature. That's not the same as needing to do the very long and very difficult task of teaching people that even though we might not live and enjoy ourselves in the wilderness, or kind of, hike through the snowy mountains, or, hike through Tasmania, as I try and do every year, that we still rely on the natural world. And even though the natural, we might not have it in our hearts and present, we cannot continue to exploit it the way we do. So it's actually quite challenging to be able to talk to people who have no interest in camping and don't really care about any of those things, that they do have to act on climate. So that's one of those challenges. So just kind of thinking about that, about those dual challenges that we face when we talk about climate. There are just some terrific questions in the chat, but to go back to address your question, Janet, I suppose the thing that came as one of the things I've found writing the book is, in the end, I couldn't really quite identify which. I was surprised about how productive and useful the full spectrum of emotion can be when we manage our views about climate change, but also how we communicate. Except, and it's been a bit controversial, I don't think that shame really works particularly well. I think that shame can be really volatile emotion. I've yet to be convinced that it can be quite productive in talking about, in getting people to engage with climate who aren't already engaged. And I suppose that's one of the, there's some lovely overlaps between what I've done and what Jonica has done, but I think Jonica's book is a wonderful tonic for people who are struggling with dealing with climate. And once you are able to read her book and get her to help you do that, from a position of kind of perhaps more scientific objectivity, if you want to convince other people in your social circle who aren't that convinced about climate, then you might get some tips from my book, I suppose. So I've yet to, while I feel a level of shame, when you were saying before, Janet, thinking about the Great Barrier Reef, I've taken my oldest child there to snorkel, but I'm a bit worried about taking some of my younger children. I want to take them, but I also don't know quite what to say to them when they see the reef dying. And in the same way that I didn't quite know what to say to them when they said to me during the Black Summer fires, is this what it's going to be like all the time? Like, why is this happening? And, why can't we go outside and those kinds of things? So anyway, shame, a very interesting emotion. I'm still on the fence a bit about whether it can ever be helpful.
Thanks, Rebecca. And in your book, Jonica, you have other emotions in there like creativity, which includes the arts, and you've interviewed Missy Higgins, and also humour. And you talk about these emotions being maybe helpful ways of even crossing barriers between different types of people. Do you want to say a little bit more about some of those things?
Yeah. So the creativity chapter, admittedly, I don't know that creative outlets, a bit like what Rebecca was saying, creativity really does preach to the converted. So I had to think to myself about, well, what is the purpose of, let's just write another song at it, that'll fix it, And in fact, what I realised is that the creativity of, say, writing songs, doing art, all that sort of thing, they're just incredibly important for our own well-being, those that are already in the converted. They may or may not reach across the divide, which is what Rebecca's obvious book is all about and why we all need to read it. It's a fabulous book. So with Missy, she had to deal with her own profound climate grief, and she found that the way that it worked for her, it's a very soulful interview, was to actually dive into it with her art and actually imagine the worst possible future. And she's written songs about that, and they're absolutely beautiful. And what I found out later from a psychologist is that what she was doing was actually a deep dive into what might be called radical acceptance, where you actually really do face your fears and let them be with you for a bit, and then work out what would sustain you, and come back from that and bring that courage and sustenance and cathartic emotion into the present. It's a bit like, facing a cancer diagnosis or something like that. You do actually have to face your worst fear, right? She wrote these beautiful songs, and I think what those things do is they not only help the artist, but of course they help give courage and sustenance to all the rest of us. With humour, I always wanted to include a chapter in humour because I think it's always underrated in these kind of spaces, and yet it's so important. And there are a couple of important with humour relevant to your question. One is that, you know, it evolved for a reason. There's a reason it's so ubiquitous. You know, we laugh in the worst possible circumstances. In fact, when people had just lost their houses, I was asking people, you know, what jokes are you making? And they all of a sudden, you know, they're so surprised and they light up, and then they tell me the jokes that they've been making about their burnt to the ground house. You know, it's like this natural instinct we have, because what laughter does is it brings down our arousal, our stress levels. And it releases dopamine and also oxytocin, which is a really important bonding chemical. But the other thing, the other interview, and I had a good chat with Charlie Pickering about that. But the other thing about humour is that it can also be one of those ways of getting around people's tribal barriers. And I had a chat to Craig Newcastle about that as a communication, rather than sort of confronting face on with the fear. The little bits of jokes, the little bit of trying to see things from the other perspective, and Rebecca, you should follow on from me and go much further into that, actually do keep the door open for communication and can sort of sneak under the radar. Yeah, Rebecca?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that what I've found in message testing, where surprising humorous approaches to climate have been employed, especially given our need to kind of wrest the climate conversation away from the culture wars, the kind of very unedifying kind of tangle which it's gotten in terms of partisan politics and the culture wars, is that there is this unfair and yet persistent characterisation of environmentalists and people who care about climate change as being kind of against joy and against fun, and all about trying to take the things that you really enjoy away from you, like, you know, and have you shivering in cages, shivering in caves with wearing Birkenstocks and eating tofu, which is, I'm sure, what some people like to do on the weekend, but isn't for me. So one of the things that humour does is it disrupts, and what we need at the moment, and disruption is a very overused word like transition, but we do need to disrupt perceptions and unfair yet persistent stereotypes about the kinds of people who care about climate change and the kinds of people who care about the environment. And if we can find a way to kind of inject some joy and fun into the conversation, then that it can help disrupt it, but it can also help a level of engagement at it as well. So I think that's what it has the potential to do.
Thanks. And in relation to the arts, I suppose, and the creativity, I've always believed, or I do believe, that it does help with bringing people together who are not necessarily already in the same bubble, because it is a way of connecting us to our common humanity, sinking into an artistic sort of expression of humanity, really, and who we are.
Yeah, sorry, Janet, I certainly didn't mean to dismiss that possibility at all. I mean, I think both are incredibly valid, and obviously if you go back to, say, Peter Garrett and some of the great protest songs from Midnight Oil, you know, they really had the capacity to reach across to a broad number of people. And we know that, like laughter, music, for example, and I haven't seen the studies on art, but I'm sure it's the same, but music in particular, we release oxytocin and we feel bonded with everyone that's listening or singing or participating in the music. So yeah, these are powerful community bonding forces that go across sort of divisive conversations.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to talk to a little bit to both of you about the discussion you have in your books about denial, but I might just come back to that in a minute if you bear with me, because I want to sort of segue into a little bit about one of the key themes that we have in the Women's Climate Congress is bringing people together to get past our polarised political discourse. So, and as Lynn read out at the beginning, our vision statement says we resist judgment and blame. So we're trying to think, you know, how can we draw a line in the sand of what's gone before in relation to all of the stuff that we really want to blame people for, but sort of say that we're all sort of in this together, we're jointly responsible, we've all enjoyed our this really wonderful Western lifestyle that's come about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So how can we go forward together? So we've been advocating for some sort of stakeholder process that would actually bring people together, and we think this might actually involve some very carefully facilitated processes to create spaces where we can bring people together, not just in private conversations, but in our public discourse a little bit more. So I sort of wanted to ask you, particularly maybe Rebecca, about this, because I've heard you speaking in other webinars and things that you've given about this political polarization that we have as being the one really big issue that we need to sort of try and overcome. So
So what the political polarization well, first of all, I want to start with the positive, which is that the vast majority of Australians believe the climate is changing, worry about it. Some people worry about it now, but the majority of people worry about it more for future generations, and want the government to do something, think it's important, right? So that's consistent. But underneath that, there is a polarization in terms of how urgent people think it is, how much they see it impacting their lives today, and what they're prepared to forego or give up in order for it to happen, right? So that's where the polarization comes from. The polarization is the result of decades and decades of millions, if not billions of dollars spent by the people that want to keep the fossil fuel industry going to be able to make people feel that way, right? Political polarization leads. So delay is the new denial. Polarization means that things go slower because you've just got to, there's so much more to bring everybody together. But it's happening, and it's happening. There's lots of things happening in the last couple of years that are making me feel more optimistic. So I suppose, sorry, that was all preamble to ask your question, which was again, sorry.
Well, I'm sort of wondering how we can take these sort of conversations.
Oh, yes, the conversation.
Into the more public,
I think, that's where I was going. So one of the things we know is that the more climate change is important to you, either as a denialist or either as somebody on the denial end of the scale or somebody who's really passionate about it, the more comfortable you are about speaking about it. Everybody else, the vast majority of Australians, think about it but don't talk about it. Why? Because they don't want to start fights. They feel like maybe I don't know enough, and maybe I don't want to annoy people, and I don't want to be one of those pushy political people. So our biggest challenge is breaking the climate silence. But then not just generally, not just in necessarily forums like this are terrific, and there are lots of forums like this everywhere, but in surprising places, right? Amongst surprising people. So that is the challenge. We know that when that happens, when climate change is something that gets talked about in a whole range of contexts, then engagement with climate change and openness to act is obvious. If we look at the research about young people under the age of 25, right, regardless of where they sit politically, where they are economically, anything about them, the vast majority of them are alarmed and concerned, and only 1% of them could be described as denialists compared to 9% of the population. Why? I tell you why. They learn about it at school in the way I didn't. Right? Climate change is there in geography, in science, elsewhere, and it's there talked about in their peer group. So that combination, and that's not just here in Australia, but overseas, talked to lots and lots of young climate activists who said, we learnt about it at school, and then we went back to our communities and we saw it happen in action, and we realised it was only ever going to get worse. And so this combination of those two things is really critical. So if we make talking about climate change something that is easier to do and something that everybody can do, and then we are really going to accelerate the move towards doing something about it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Jonica, do you want to add something? Because you had some thoughts about the language we use.
Well, I guess that's right. I guess that comes more from my decades on Catalyst, actually. And also, I have family members and lots of friends who think very, very different things to me. So, I end up in potential fights all the time, and have done for the last 15, 20 years. So I've had to find my own intuitive ways through that without the benefit of the social research to back it up. So I've gone with my gut as a storyteller. But one of those things is trigger words. So when I did my big climate specials on Catalyst, the first one I did was called Taking Australia's Temperature, which was 10 years ago. And we've gone up 0.1 of a degree since I did that. You know, that freaks me out already. And I was deliberately aiming at my dad's cohort, which was the very wealthy, conservative owners of banks and vineyards and all the rest. So I deliberately put wineries in there instead of other agriculture as an example of climate change. I did all sorts of clever things. I put golf in there. I was really trying to reach across. Fishing was another major trope in there. So when I was looking at what was changing in the climate, I was picking these examples that I knew would get outside the skiing. Exactly. That's when I first started being allergic to the skiing issue, because I figured a lot of people, well, I love the snow, but also a lot of people ski who would have been in that conservative in power group. And I avoided all trigger words in that. I didn't use the word climate until the last sentence in a half-hour special. And then, because I knew that would get their backs up. A few years later, I did one about battery-powered homes, and I put every single person in it. Every scientist was a CEO, and I put them in a suit. And again, I personally didn't mention climate change more than a couple of times. It was implicit, but it didn't get their backs up. It didn't have those sort of reactive where they shut down and shut the brain down. So I'm really aware of avoiding trigger words where I can. These days I do use climate change more, but then it was more of a trigger. But then bypassing and going straight to the fantastic renewable future we're going to have, you know, the economies of the future. I'm finding now these conversations really do resonate with my friends who still won't sort of admit that climate change is real. But when we talk about the economic futures, what Mike Cannon-Brookes and others, Twiggy Forrest, etc., I can find common ground. There's another word that I've had a real problem with lately, and this is not something that I found with Catalyst, but some of the younger activists talking about sacrifice. What will you give up? That kind of thing. And we know from behavioural economics that people don't like to give things up. None of us do. But we actually give things up all the time, only we don't call it that. We don't call it a sacrifice. We call it a gift or a contribution. You know, when we bake a cake for someone's birthday, that's a cost, you know, that's a sacrifice. I took my time, I bought the ingredients.
Right. No one says I sacrificed eggs and milk to make this cake.
Exactly. And so getting the word sacrifice or giving out of our language, I think is really useful as well. But what would you contribute to this fabulous future? You know, what would you give for this fabulous future? And that comes back to sort of harnessing those pro-social emotions. Yeah, I might stop there. There's another little bit I wanted to talk about, which is positive psychology, but I'll come back to that.
But just to dovetail off what Jonica said, when she's talking about sacrifice and gift versus you know, that kind of language, that's exactly right. So, but all human beings every day make a kind of a think about loss and gain in anything that they do. Like, what am I doing and what will I get back? Right. And we make those calculations almost imperceptibly, you know, imperceptibly in our head. And so anything to do with climate is all about trying to balance for different audiences with different things about the loss and gain equation. Okay, so we're asking you to do something such as, you know, put solar panels on your roof. What are you going to gain? Yes, you're going to pay to do that. What are you going to gain from that? Like, so it's this idea that we can motivate people entirely through the idea that everything's going to be fine as long as we don't have to change in any way, or we don't have to do things differently in any way, is not realistic. But similarly, this kind of idea that we just have to suffer for the sins of the past and all the rest of it doesn't work anyway, doesn't work either.
Yeah. So yes, I might just for a moment come back to that question I mentioned earlier about you both mentioning having parts of your book talking about essentially denial. Jonica, in your book, you have an expression which you talk about, Chernobyl brain, which I actually found incredibly helpful, because it's the idea that some people are so wired, if you like, to not be able to accept that, you know, there's an extreme danger happening, that they will sort of continue. And I can see it all around me, and how some people respond, how some people responded to the bushfires. My own husband, in fact, when we were down in our South Coast property just before New Year last year, was just not able to sort of conceive that the risk was what it was actually, and that we needed to leave.
Yeah.
And so that, and then also in your book, Rebecca, you mentioned that maybe people who are hanging on to old economic paradigms and, you know, business as usual,
Yeah.
are really frightened that the whole of Western civilization will collapse if the economy changes. So their fear around the change is as great as our fear is around climate change.
No, and they've been let down before with economic transition, you know. So they would have been, to some of those people, they remember the promises of the kind of the early 1980s, that privatization and selling off major assets and, you know, opening the world up to a kind of, you know, more user pays economy would benefit them. And it did benefit some people, but it didn't for other people. So, you know, so they've seen every time we've had massive economic change that they haven't done particularly well. And the same wealthy people stay wealthy. I mean, that's one of the challenges we have now, and I'm testing stuff around renewable energy and the transition to renewable energy. And I talk about these large-scale renewable energy projects and all the rest of it. And the fact that you've got people like Andrew Forrest really interested in hydrogen. When you're testing that work, people sometimes go, oh, it's just the same white dudes who've made money out of fossil fuels are going to make money out of renewable energy. So we have some challenges there, you know, in terms of convincing people that action on climate is going to substantially, it's not going to leave them worse off, and that they're actually going to be cared for and protected by the governments they elect.
Yeah, but the interesting thing to me that as well in both of those two ideas, a Chernobyl brain idea and your idea about people being really frightened about the change in the economy, is there is an underlying kindness, I suppose, or in those, you know, the sympathy, I suppose, or empathy for people who are, which seem to me to be important. I think I mentioned to Jonica the other day the story of Tiddalik the frog. You know, the Indigenous story is very powerful because Tiddalik the frog has drunk all the water and clearly done the wrong thing. It's been, but the other animals, they make him laugh, and he then spews up all the water. So there's a kind of, and Indigenous First Nations stories often have a sort of underlying kindness about them, even though the one who's done the wrong thing is made to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Can I add to that, Janet? Just because I don't think we quite explain what Chernobyl brain is, or Chernobyl guy.
Yes.
So it was when I was ringing up my the guy who became this sort of like almost wise man teacher character in the book, was my friend Sandy McFarlane, who's a professor of psychiatry and a specialist in disasters and PTSD and what happens to our brain. And I wanted to ask him about denial, but not denialists, but the denial we all use that you just talked about, Janet, where your husband's like, no, what fire? Where my husband actually died in front of me, Robin, and I do CPR and he wakes up and he goes, why are you crying? No, I'm not going to hospital. Like, we're dead for 3 minutes, you know. So he's a metaphor for this kind of denial. Anyway, so my professor said to me, look, go and have a look at Chernobyl. And there's this vivid scene in the first episode where the whole bloody reactor is blown up. And this guy in charge just won't see it. Like, it's rubble, you know, a light shot into the space, you know, for 20,000 feet. And he sends person after person in there to die because he just can't believe that the world has changed so dramatically. And so there comes a point, we never think disaster is going to happen to us. We just can't. We're not wired that way. And then the more optimistic amongst us, who are often the more successful business leaders, my partner Robin, very successful, great denialist himself when it comes to his own health, because they have this fantastic optimism that nothing bad will happen. But there comes a point when the threat is so close that their brain has to flip out of that Chernobyl brain state, and different personalities will flip out of that at different stages. I'm a more anxious personality, so I'm more likely to be threat aware. And so I guess what I was trying to do by taking that approach to denial in the book was, as you say, be kind to both sides, try and explain each other to both sides. And it's also, there's no blame, no shame, as Rebecca was talking about. Like, okay, well, now you as the intelligent person you can come and say that climate change is real. Like, it's okay, you know, it's things have changed, and you as an intelligent person have changed your mind. You know, there comes a point where the brain has to flip into accepting that the threat is real. And obviously the ultimate metaphor is what happened in the fires, and people just going, yeah, it can't happen, you know, turning up into a fire area for their holiday. And I think an understanding of that does help explain some of the wildly different reactions we get to the threat of something like climate change. But climate change is really difficult because it's like our own deaths. It feels really distant, and it's really hard to imagine.
So I'm thank you very much, and for filling in on Chernobyl brain, which I introduced that concept from left field. So I'm sort of getting a little anxious about the time, and seeing that there are hundreds, lots and lots of comments, 56 new messages coming into the chat.
Great comments.
We will publish all the chat after, and we respond to it even more if we can. I actually really, given that we are the Women's Climate Congress, I just wanted to spend a few minutes just before we go to the chat on the idea of women's leadership and what women are bringing. I mean, you know, two wonderful women here have written books, both able to talk about emotion and bringing emotion into the equation. And there's been other recent examples too. Danielle Sellemeyer has written a book called Summertime, which is an amazing expression of her own journey through the bushfire summer and her relationship to the environment. And also a young woman, Sarah Wilson, has written a book recently, The One Wild and Precious Life, which is again her own journey. So it seems that a lot of women are coming to the table bringing this more emotional discourse to the table. And I know that you say in your book, at one point in your book, Rebecca, that women don't talk about climate change as much as men, but on the other hand, if you look around the environmental movement, you know, the women seem to be everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, look, there's a mixed picture. So the social science shows that young women in particular can be excellent and probably really, really effective climate communicators and very persuasive. We've got a greater interest, as Jonica would know, over time from women to go into STEM, to go into subjects where communicating about climate change, communicating about science, and communicating about some of the technological solutions to climate. So we're much more likely to have women leaders in those areas. It still needs to be encouraged, particularly women in engineering, new green opportunities around engineering and industry. And of course, we need more women at the C-suite asking these questions about climate in corporate Australia, although we're starting to have that more. I've done a lot of work with industry super funds, some of them being led by women as well in relation to climate. So we've got a lot of women's leadership. In terms of the community, those people who feel distance from the political structures, and those people who feel like women are far more likely to say, I don't know enough about politics to have a view. What research has shown is they probably know just as much about politics as their counterpoint, as their male partner, who thinks that that's enough information to have a view. So, so there's that. There's a general issue that we have around political confidence to talk about something which seems to require a PhD in science and intricate knowledge of Australian politics to be able to talk about it in a way that makes people feel comfortable. But we've also seen in some cohorts that having children, we see it with men and women, but a bit more pronounced with women, that having children or having grandchildren can sometimes be a trigger for activism. So to generalise about how women engage with climate in Australia, of course, is problematic. There's lots and lots of kind of, strands to it. Of course, some of the most effective, passionate and persuasive communicators on climate are First Nations women who are leaders in their community around the world, leaders in their community, whether it be in the Torres Strait, whether it be in communities in inland Australia that are suffering from issues around water. So we have that as well, and we always have that globally. So I think, look, we can always do better with women's representation in every sphere, but my greater concern is that the climate movement is too white. So we, Australia is not, if you look at the census, we are not an Anglo country anymore. We don't have the kind of diversity that we see in communities reflected in the leadership in an engagement in the environment movement. If you think about places, for example, just in Sydney, where I live, that are hugely impacted by climate. So the outer western suburbs of Sydney, places like Penrith, which are on any day of the summer, 8 or 9% degrees hotter than they are in the inner city. Those communities are hugely ethnically diverse. And so we're talking about voices of women, we need diverse voices of women in the climate movement, and within the climate movement that is focused on women as well. And Anne just posted about Seed Mob, amazing group of young people.
Do you want to add something there, Jonica? About?
Oh, well, yes, one of the things, and I'd be interested in Rebecca expanding on this when I finish, just about, the degree to which you actually can reach across your own tribe. Like some can, some can't. I'm quite aware that people who read my book, for example, are probably going to be people similar to me. I don't mean ethnically, but perhaps with the sort of the background in university educated, this kind of thing, caring about the environment, probably female. So the degree to which we as individuals can personally reach across, or as a group reach across into very different tribes, and that diversity question, I'd be interested in Rebecca's ideas, but generally, obviously the activist groups that are deliberately going out and training and fostering leaders, often women leaders, in as broad a group in society as they can, they're amongst the most effective activism groups that there are at the moment, I think. What was I going to add about female leadership? Look, I just wanted to bring in a little bit from something I recently did, which was launch a book by Professor Felicia Hubbard on positive psychology. So it's called Creating the Future We Want, or Creating the World We Want. Sorry, I can't quite find my note. Anyway, so a lot of these, one of the things is, can we bring back the pro-social emotions, compassion and empathy into leadership and the political sphere? And it does seem, whatever reason, that women do tend to represent that more, whether because we've been socialized from a very young age to think that way, whether because we're more likely to seek a leadership position less out of ego, more out of wanting to actually fix the problem. I do not know. I do not pretend to be an expert. But when you look at the positive psychology and what it might apply, how it might apply to society instead of individuals, which is what this book is about, it talks about, a society where people are flourishing. And this is a society where empathy and compassion are actually, considered important in public discourse. And one of the things that they So she talks about, I love the word flourishing, you know, what makes a flourishing person or a flourishing society. Connected, feeling autonomy, feeling competent, having meaning in your life, and paying attention to what's going well. Just a note on that, having attention to what's going well. This is a slight dogleg, but this really resonated with me. We can very easily get back to that personal self-care thing. We can very easily get overwhelmed by all the negative news. We need to consciously train ourselves to look at what's going really, really well as well for our own personal well-being, but also when communicating outward about climate things, you know, as we all know, talking about this project or that amazing thing, the heroes that are out there, the positive things that are being done actually work a lot better than just focusing on what's negative all the time. And yeah, wouldn't it be great if we had more metrics of well-being in our governance? And I know there are women trying to do that, and Jacinda Ardern, she put it into New Zealand as part of the, you know, the measures.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, thanks, Jonica. And it opens up so many other sort of threads of things that we could follow up. And I'm a bit conscious of the time, and I know, I'm just going to bring Lynn back in. I'm sure because I can see now 93 new messages in there. So how are you going there, Lynn, with the chat?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to the chat, and recommend that you have a look at it, because it's been a parallel conversation of sharing and caring that is really quite profound, and a lovely thing to see in conjunction with the conversation we've been having on the main screen. And there's just some wonderful stuff there, but I thought I might pick aspects of two questions as a kind of a bringing together as we're coming to the end of our time together. And the first one was from Padma Priya, who was saying, how do we deal with hopelessness? Because it can feel overwhelming when, despite all the positive things we've talked about, the risk is real and many people are still not appreciating it. So one aspect of the question is about hopelessness. And the other question is from Joe Dodds saying, what do you feel most positive about in all this? What is the thing that keeps you going in terms of positive direction and hope?
I might jump in with the hopelessness thing, just because back to that sort of, that's directly to the self-care question. You know, what happens when you hit the despair? What happens when you hit the overwhelm? Which is what started my journey of the book, because I had personally hit that point. And look, there's a number of strategies that I came across, and I don't have time to go into them all here. There's and this is relevant for parents with their kids exactly as well. Like, how do you deal with some of these doomism feelings that young people have, obviously, as a parent? How do you guide through that when you're struggling to actually deal with it yourself? So I personally had a big problem with hope, because I felt like it felt like a personal failing that I didn't have hope anymore. And that it kept leading me into despair when, for example, you get someone like a Trump elected, when it really, really matters what happens over the next year. How do you avoid falling into despair? Well, I think to a degree, one of the things about grief is you kind of have to just go through it, but how do you come out the other side? And I had a few conversations, but active hope ended up, and I'm sure Rebecca knows all about this too, a lot of people suggested this philosophy to me. So active hope is a different way of thinking about hope, and it's the keys in the first word, active. And so I'll just do a quick little summary of my understanding of the philosophy of active hope. So it's a way of having sort of action and hope going forward, but not slipping back into denial and just assuming everything will be fine. So you hold in your head two different futures. One is this future where things, don't change and we just go down that worst possible path. So you're aware that that's a possibility of future. And then you hold in your head, you imagine the best possible future from this point. And then your gift of active hope is your action. So there's always an action implicit in the hope. And then they go further in that and say that, hit that overwhelm, consider it as the deep dive, almost like, if you're an alcoholic, just suddenly realizing, okay, I've got to go through this and do something about it and come out the other side, and use it as a bouncing point to come out with courage and motivation and a realistic approach. Realistic hope is another term that I've seen used. And she uses this really nice term, which is use it as a call to adventure. And you go and catch your inspiring vision, and then that might be what you do as your action. There's a whole lot of things too about that mix between action and acceptance, like not over personalizing the problem, because you alone can't solve things, but you can be part of groups that are trying to do really active things. So yeah, I think basically grief acknowledges that you love, and you have to come through that and out into the action and motivation out the other side with courage.
Rebecca, do you want to comment on that?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I've my chapter on hope is a riff on everything that Jonica said, and draws on similar kinds of material. I would say two things. I think, first of all, hopelessness and periods of hopelessness are inevitable. And there's actually another kind of really quite useful term, is this idea of toxic positivity. So this kind of idea that you're not going to feel hopeless or overwhelmed at times is unrealistic. I think you have your own personally devised tactics for dealing with that, which are going to be very personal to you about whether and what they might be. And then I also think there's something to be said for when you do, as Jonica said, kind of bounce back into activism, which is what most people do, to tell you the truth, is to kind of recalibrate what you've decided, how that period of hopelessness and how that recalibrates what you want to do. I've seen some people become then more ambitious, right? Kind of like, okay, I feel a bit hopeless and then I'm going to do something different, or I'm going to be bigger. And other people scale it down a bit, to be able to go, all right, well, I've had people say, look, this is all too much, but I'm just going to throw myself into the community gardens of my local area and, do that. And that is not nothing. So I think that knowing that climate change will continue to shape our world for as long as for the foreseeable future, we have to ensure that our engagement with hope, hopelessness, action is it itself. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
I agree, and very much so. And I guess just to go back to that term grief, that was one of the reasons I ended up at, or hopelessness, whatever the two are. Grief isn't something that is ever over. You just become better at managing it, and it doesn't have unrealistic expectations with it either. So yeah, things will, I'll be in tears again, I'm sure. This stuff comes and goes, and that's okay. You can accept it.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Jonica, is there, if you're asked the question what you're most positive about, what would it be? What would be your answer?
Well, as Rebecca said early on in this conversation, I think that the turmoil of the last 2 years has been extraordinary, and there've been a lot more sort of courageous heroes, in inverted commas. So one of my bits of advice was look for heroes. I love the language of epic narrative. I love Lord of the Rings, so that language speaks to me. There are people really on a world stage really pushing. There are business leaders who are really feeling this emotional tipping point and realizing it's not just a financial bottom line, it is actually a question of the future of their own kids. And there is, through all this turmoil, it is sort of, it's going to be an exciting decade, whatever else you want to say about it. But there is this feeling of these forces are really kind of coming to the fore now, both for and against. And it's like, you don't quite know. You're barracking, you know, for goodness to triumph. But the other thing that gives me a lot of positivity and hope is the pro-social emotions. So we saw in disaster that rather than us all turning inward and being isolationist and, you know, turning into the post-apocalyptic cannibals of the road, at least 80% of us are driven, I think, and I don't have exact figures on that, but we're driven by the pro-social emotions of compassion, gratitude, and overwhelmed by an urge to help. There's always going to be a pretty big chunk of the population who, because of the way their brains are shaped, they have low empathy and they are not going to be that. But the majority of us actually do, in extremis, come together and look after our fellows. So these pro-social emotions are things like gratitude, compassion, love. And the big one I'm going to throw in there is pride. I still think pride, you know, is one of the most important emotions to appeal to and to get people moving forward. It's like wanting to feel good about doing right by your community, and whatever community that is. And I think that, you know, just the vision of all those firefighters, volunteer firefighters out there every day. I mean, I cried every time I saw someone in uniform, you know, for months, because you just felt so proud of your fellow Australians, you know, giving it their best shot. And so I do feel that when everyone eventually hits that social tipping point and sort of, well, most people anyway, and goes out of their Chernobyl guy brain and somehow accept that the future we have to change what we're doing, that we will all kind of more or less pull together. That's where I put some of my active hope anyway.
Okay, thanks. I'm really aware of time, but Rebecca, I want to give you just a minute if you could.
I mean, I agree with all of that. Lots of stuff is happening. Lots of stuff is happening. I come across 6 or 7 different people, campaigns, activists, bits of information every day in the work that I do as a consultant on climate communication. I want people to give you something little. I want people to Google miners in Teslas. This guy called Daniel who takes coal miners, and he even took Malcolm Roberts from One Nation. He took them for a drive in a Tesla. It's brilliant. And it's just joyful and fun. It's basically saying to people, this world that you're so scared of, you shouldn't be scared of. This is interesting. So I think that the climate movement is becoming a lot more creative. So much is happening at so many different directions to move stuff along. Lots of people know about them, but I think that there are also lots of fantastic things happening at a small level, at a big level, at a systemic level, at a cultural level. It's all happening a bit. Yes, we could have done with it 10 years ago, but there's a momentum that's building that's almost irresistible even to our federal government. And I look forward to the moment that we see things shift definitively.
Thank you. Hand back to you now, Janet. Thanks a lot, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and so sorry that we could only skim such a small part of that very rich chat, which I've just also been having a little bit of a look through, but we will publish that as a report on our website along with the video. I'm also a little bit sad because Jonica does have a wonderful story from her book, which she refers to as the 2 buckets story, about a guy in Malakuta with his buckets fighting the fires. And we just haven't had time to fit that in. I'm going to be very cheeky later, I think, and ask Jonica if she could Zoom herself reading the story, and we'll put that on the website along with all the other information about today, if that's possible. But too many wonderful threads of conversation to fit into 1.25 hours, and still a lot more to say. So thank you very much to Jonica and Rebecca for coming today and for your contributions, which have been absolutely marvellous. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Round of applause. And just as we go, I'm going to very quickly share my screen and just to tell you about our next conversation. I hope you can see that, which will be on the 10th of August. That'll actually be the 2nd Tuesday in August. And we're going to be welcoming Dr. Michelle Maloney, who's the convener of Australian Earth Laws Alliance, among other things. And also very excited to have Associate Professor Mary Graham, First Nations woman who, I don't know whether any of you, some of you might have heard her speak before, a very, very inspiring speaker. So we're very excited to be having those two guests at our next conversation, and that event will be promoted very soon. I'm also really excited to announce that our website for our National Congress of Women at the end of November is gone live today, and our registration site has now gone live at this website address here, nationalcongressofwomen.com. And so do go there and have a look. We're hoping to have a very lively congress, in Canberra at that time, with more conversations like this, and also developing a statement from women, which we can take to government after that Congress. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today and for staying with this conversation. I'll just stop my sharing, for the extra time that we allocated for today, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.